So I find it interesting. Now uh, I've been writing lately a lot, and when I write, I tend to think in an integrated way instead of isolating things out into these different fields of study. I tend to think of how they work all together. So that with this ITO thing, it's a little symbolism, and I'm calling it ITO to give it a name because you need a name in order for people to think of something, as an entity. And so the psychological part of this for me is that when I come up with some simple symbolism, some system or modeling system like this, and I have dozens of various kinds of things, that would fall into this category. When I present something like this, or like relativistic skepticism, something that I've named, identified certain elements of, a modeling system. I know that I've simplified things. That's what models do. And so you go into the differences between, the elements of your model and the reality. And this helps you know how to map how to apply your model. It's part of what you need to have an applied system. Now with ITO, I have a very, straightforwardly simple, like predicate logic level of symbolism. And, and I also want to analyze, well, look, how does this work when you bring it into the calculus sphere of analyzing, continuous things. And then to make the links back and forth. And this is what you have in mathematics. You have these elemental ideas, and with infinite sums, and you get these idea in infinite divisions, you get these idea of integration, and you have a smooth cooperation. You apply something like predicate logic differently, but ultimately you can put one in terms of the other. There's a shared foundation through that system, and that's what I'm talking about. Now, the main difference is, in predicate logic, literally, the difference is you have things that are either true or false. So these are like, if you look at them in time, procedurally, things that happen over time, then they produce an answer of true or false given some input. So the input's open, but what they output is limited to true and false, and this is so that certain mathematics work. Well, with ITO, you say we want to think about thinking, so we say, well, there's a way of thinking T, and we start from this fundamental idea. But instead of saying it can only, produce this judgment, basically, of true or false, we say, well, it can produce anything of the same kinds of things that it gets input. Okay. The difference will be that it may have left some fingerprint of itself on its outputs that don't have to be there on the inputs, right? So, and the initial idea of going, well, there's a way of thinking T, is that, well, if we're going to have a social system, we all need to variabilize over T, because the initial scope is that there's a way of thinking P that's Piro's way, and a way of thinking, 2B, which is 2B's way, and so on. And to me, I've just named these, whatever that is, whether it's willful, deliberative, there's a metaphysics or not, any of those things, it's the way of thinking. We've given it a name, whatever it is, we'll investigate. And then the same with input. Now, some people have come back, and this is the point, there's not an interest, of course, in how this thing scales up to a more calculus dynamic approach, but really on a basic thing like questioning whether a thinking process might have something besides input involved with it. Now, the closest I could think of that is, if we apply materialism, for example, and we think, well, the thinking process is going on in nerves. Is the configuration of the nerves, input to the way of thinking? It's actually executing the way of thinking. And it's a bit of a mind twister puzzler and a materialism. But in terms of this more epistemological and subjectively epistemological approach, yes, it's input. Right? It's in principle input. Now, is the idea that there's input that you can't detect? Well, if it detects your way of thinking, then that will detect the output perceptions of your way of thinking. And in comparison of those, you can tell things like, for example, what if your blood sugar is off? So you're feeling lightheaded. You can notice this. Some of the outputs are realizations that, oh, I'm feeling lightheaded. And so you might not get a direct information that your blood sugar's off, but you'll see that there is an effect. Whatever affects the way of thinking is by the definition perceptible. So there's some weird conundrums with, well, what about inputs that you can't sense? But either there's some ramification that affects your way of thinking, or it truly doesn't affect your way of thinking. And yes, those imperceptible inputs, remain some rhetorical issue. But it doesn't have to be a part of our consideration of how thinking works, because we, by definition, just describe something that doesn't affect thinking. So yeah, I mean, at the point where I say, look, we can think about all thinking processes in terms of a thinking process and its input and output, and that's a whole picture. Now, there's infinite detail in, well, what is an input, what is an output? Those questions are left open, but in terms of trying to name everything involved in the process, it's got to be one of those things. We even have issues of like, well, if the way the thinking works is an input, what's the distinction between thinking and perceptions? Well, there isn't a material distinction there. The feeling process is the thinking process, and those could be one and the same, but we subjectively still have a distinction. The distinction is in the perceptions, the input and what I call the input and output. We have perceptions of them. The way of thinking is the processing we do to those perceptions that we don't have direct perception of. We just have these outputs that come spot checks along the way. It's hard to interpret what it means even. And so the way of thinking is symbolically representing whatever spans between the input and output perceptions. And I mentioned this in the last video. Maybe there's a constant stream of input, and it's really just a conceptual infinitesimal span in which there's no input, and perhaps this constant stream is the way of thinking. Okay, that's all still open. Subjectively, however, when we're bundling inputs into sets and outputs into sets and trying to reason from one to the other and describe it with principles and other cognitive, descriptive artifacts, concepts, then we have something that, in essence is whatever spans the perceptible, whatever this, it's noticeable by its effect, but not by the fact that it itself is made of a perceptive substance or whatever. So we see it by its effects, and it really is a position, a posit that there is a connection between our past perceptions and our future perceptions, right? And even that's not totally assumed in the system because it opens it to debate. But of course, for the system to be useful, yes, we have to think there is a connection between our past perceptions and the perceptions that we generate as a result of thinking about those past perceptions.